with questions. Like I said, I will be monitoring that and tracking that for questions, and we'll save it towards the end. If we don't get to it, because we are starting just a couple minutes late, Lindsay will be sure to reach out and we will make sure questions get answered. And if you need a certificate or Growing Futures credit, the link will be provided at the end, and just be sure to complete that. Without further ado, I will turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Lindsay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you see my screen okay, and can you hear me okay?
Looks great.
Perfect, thank you. Sorry for the late start. I am not in my normal office today, so trying to get everything hooked up and figured out it just took a little extra time, but I'm so grateful you're here. My name is Lindsay Burkhart, former director of the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force, and now I serve as the director of prevention initiatives at Families Flourish ND. Wow, I honestly just thrilled to share this space with you all. Over 200 people signed up for this session. I think this is one of the biggest signups that we had. That kind of turnout speaks volumes about the shared commitment to protecting children and building safer communities. One thing
I can just ask real quick for everybody to mute, that would be great.
Thank you. You'll notice my presentation is bright and it's colorful, and that is very, very intentional. The colors reflect the hope that we hold for every child's future and the belief that prevention is not only possible, we can do it. Prevention is possible and it's powerful. For me, doing this work over the last 3 years, it's a powerful reminder that while this work is heavy, it's rooted in possibility, action, and hope. Every strategy that we're discussing today is part of building a world where children are protected, supported, and safe from child sexual abuse. And I know today people are joining for different reasons. Some of you may be here in a professional capacity, committed to protecting children and preventing harm in the systems and spaces you work. Others may be here in a personal role as parents, caregivers, grandparents, loved ones, foster care parents, driven by your deep care and concern for the safety of the children in your lives. So whether you're here today wearing both hats or just one hat, this session is for you. You are a part of a community that holds the power to prevent child sexual abuse by creating environments where children can feel safe, supported, and empowered. Your presence here matters. Thank you so much for being here. Here's a quick look at our agenda over the next hour. We have a lot of content to fit in over the lunch hour here. We're going to start specifically with talking more about child sexual abuse, kind of doing a comprehensive overview of the issue. Then we'll talk about children's sexual development, and then we'll talk through some signs and impacts of child sexual abuse, and then we'll end the session with some resources, system supports, and then what we can do as adults to protect children. Quick introduction. My name is Lindsay Burkhart. I'm from an area called Great Bend, North Dakota. I grew up on a farm in a really rural part of the state. My background is in early childhood education. Over the last 15 years, my professional career has been dedicated to helping serve others through working in Head Start, working with the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program, and working with victims of juvenile criminal cases and coordinating the Restorative Justice Program. 3 years I spent as the director of the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force, and now I currently serve as the director of prevention initiatives at FFND. I am a mama, and that is the hat I wear. I'm the most proud. I have 4 kind, smart, funny daughters. You can see them on screen a little bit. I am a BioGirls volunteer. I am on like my 5th or 6th season, and it's a program I love so much. And then my sort of fun fact is that I'm an ordained minister. I've conducted 3 weddings, and I'm officiating 2 more in 2026. I do this work not only to create a better tomorrow for the children across our state. I do it for my children, but I'm also very driven to do this work for the survivors in my life who I love, and survivors everywhere. There are an estimated 42 million adult survivors in the United States today. What I want to do before we start, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the emotional weight of today's topic. The information I'll be sharing in the next few slides can be difficult to hear and potentially triggering, whether it affects you in a personal way or not. These conversations can be difficult, and they're not always conversations we're comfortable having. So whether it affects you in a through personal experience, situations you've encountered in your work, simply the gravity of the issue, please take care of yourself throughout our time together. You're not alone in feeling the weight and the impact of these conversations. We're going to start off by defining the issue. The North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force defined child sexual abuse as any interaction between a child and another person in which a child is used for the sexual behaviors and activities through contact or non-contact behaviors. When we, in our definition, refer to a child, we're referring to an individual under the age of 18. When we reference another person, that could be an adult or it could be a child. When we talk about contact behaviors, that contact abuse involves any form of physical interaction when the child, physical interaction with a child that is sexual in nature. And then those non-contact behaviors, we recently added, and that includes things like exposing a child to sexually explicit material like pornography. It can also include things like voyeurism, like looking at a child's naked body for pleasure, exhibitionism, like exposing one's genitals to a child. The one thing I really like to talk about in this section is that we don't typically talk a whole lot about those non-contact behaviors, but I think it's important to acknowledge that research shows non-contact abuse is significantly linked to adolescent distress and a lower quality of life. These findings reinforce the importance of recognizing non-contact sexual abuse as a serious form of child abuse. It's often more easily overlooked or minimized, but the emotional and psychological toll is real, it's measurable, and it's deeply impactful. So with the understanding of what the task force defines child sexual abuse as, let's talk about the prevalence across the state of North Dakota. Nationally, organizations like Darkness to Light estimate that 1 in every 10 children will experience child sexual abuse before their 18th birthday. However, a recent study published by NDSU in May of 2025, just a few months ago, offers deeper insight into the scope of child sexual abuse in North Dakota. Unlike projections based on current youth data, this study looked retrospectively, asking adults across our state about their own childhood experiences as part of a broader assessment of adverse childhood experiences. We also call those ACEs. And when it came to sexual abuse, 11.3%, which equals to about 1 in every 9 of respondents reported experiencing at least one of the following before age 18. Either being touched sexually by someone at least 5 years older or an adult, being coerced or pressured to touch someone else sexually, or being forced to have sex. And maybe you notice this, and it's hard when I can't see your faces and engage with you, but did you happen to notice that they were only asked about physical forms of child sexual abuse involving touch or sex? They didn't inquire about those non-contact forms of child sexual abuse. And so we have actually talked to some of our partners who did this study to see if we could incorporate those elements. This data reminds us that prevention isn't just about protecting children today. It's about recognizing and responding to the lasting impact of abuse across generations. From the national statistics to the NDSU study I referenced, it's important to acknowledge that these numbers likely underestimate the true scope of the impact of the problem, or the true scope of the problem. Some research estimates that up to 33% of victims never tell anyone they were abused. And this session is one that I do most frequently across the state of North Dakota. And every time I say that, 33% of victims never tell anyone they were abused. It's like a heavy weight sits on my heart because I think about the heaviness of that secret and carrying that an entire lifetime. And when they do disclose, it often takes decades. That same study found that the average age of disclosure was 52 years old. So what keeps children from disclosing? If you want to, you can put some of your thoughts in the chat box. What keeps children from disclosing? According to the National Blueprint to End Sexual Violence Against Children and Adolescents, victims often feel confused. They feel guilty. shame, embarrassed. They have a conflicted feeling of loyalty toward the abuser. They worry about getting in trouble. Fear of being shunned, labeled, loved less, being removed from their home or destroying their family. And what we also know is that sometimes perpetrators threaten to physically harm the child if they tell, harm the child themselves, harm someone the child loves, or even harm their family pet. But the one that I think really stood out to me that stuck with me, and I still remember the first time I was told it by a survivor. She had said, I had no idea what was happening to me was wrong. And she said she was 12 or 13 when she finally realized that it wasn't okay. And I think this is something we need to understand. Many children don't disclose abuse because they genuinely don't recognize it as abuse at the time. Research shows that a lack of understanding, especially when the abuser is someone trusted, is a major barrier to disclosure. And these barriers that we talked about remind us that the true scope of child sexual abuse may never be fully known. One of the things that I've really spent more time digging into, because I think it's wildly important for us to understand, are what makes children more vulnerable and what can we do to protect children. So I've spent more time working to learn risk and protective factors, and we're going to spend just a minute talking through those together next. We're going to begin with a quick definition of what we mean by risk factors and protective factors in the context of child sexual abuse. So risk factors are characteristics or conditions that increase the likelihood that a child may experience sexual abuse. And those protective factors, on the other hand, are characteristics or conditions that can reduce that likelihood or help buffer the impact of risk when it's present. It's important to note, though, that having risk factors does not mean a child will be abused, and having protective factors does not mean a child is immune. Child sexual abuse is complex, and no single factor causes or prevents abuse. Research in this area is still evolving, it's growing, and we continue to learn more about how these factors interact. So based on a research report or study that was submitted to Congress in 2019, risk and protective factors are organized using the social ecological model, which is that model you'll see on the screen, the top left, which looks at 4 levels of influence, which is the individual, relationship, community, and societal. And we could spend all day unpacking these levels and exploring this. But in honor of our time together today, I just really wanted to focus on 2 levels. We're going to talk about those individual risk factors and protective factors, and those relationship risk and protective factors. So when we start with those individual factors, these relate to a child's personal characteristics or experiences. Risk factors may include being female. Girls are statistically more likely to be victims, though boys are affected and often underreport. Having a disability. Children with disabilities are at significantly higher risk. Individuals who suffer from depression or substance use, and this may reflect underlying trauma or emotional distress. Quiet or passive demeanor. They may be perceived as less likely to resist or disclose abuse. Another risk factor at the individual level is a history of child abuse. Prior abuse increases vulnerability to further abuse. Interviews with those who sexually abuse children reveal something chilling. They can identify a potential victim in just seconds. They look for children who appear vulnerable, those who seem isolated, neglected, lacking support. Abusers are, unfortunately, highly attuned to spotting defenseless children they believe they can manipulate and control. So that's just those individual risk factors. So now let's talk about those individual protective factors. Emotional regulation being one of them. Children who have knowledge of body autonomy is a protective factor. Children who have a strong self-esteem. Knowledge of body autonomy is an important one. And instead of talking about it later, I'll talk about it now. But there was a study conducted with 91 sex offenders, and an interview done, and they asked them about body autonomy. And they said that they were less likely to target children who knew the correct anatomical terms of their body parts, because it may, one, increase their risk in getting caught, and two, if they disclose, they're going to have the language to say what's happening. So then we move on to relationship level factors. So these involve the child's family and their close social connections. So you're thinking about children who may be at risk. They may have parents that practice poor or harsh parenting. They might live without either biological parent or have a parent that is living with a live-in partner. It could be witnessing family conflict. The family could have few close friends or be more socially isolated. And then to flip the token, to talk about protective factors. At the relationship level, that is families that have supportive family relationships, positive parenting experiences. They provide warmth, encouragement, consistency. They listen, they're affectionate. Active parental supervision, right? They're intentional, they're engaged, they're consistent in their child's life. Another protective factor at the relationship level is having open communication within the home. And I know that was a super quick overview, but I hope it gives you some insight to consider and maybe help you solidify what you already knew about risk and protective factors in the context of child sexual abuse. There's a lot of work I plan to do in this area to build on this specifically and look at the different levels. I'm just not quite there yet. So with that, we've explored what child sexual abuse is. We've talked about the prevalence. We've talked about the scope of the problem. We've talked about which children may be at a higher risk or may have protective factors. But now we have to talk about who the abusers most often are. I don't know about you, but I grew up hearing a lot of stranger danger. That was probably my mother's only prevention education to me, was just being afraid of strangers. And I think it was a dominant message around child safety for decades. And I think specifically in like the 80s and the 90s, and I believe it was shaped by some of those high profile national cases. Some of you may remember cases like Jacob Wetterling or Adam Walsh. And those stories left a lasting impact on communities across our country, and they shaped about how we thought about child safety. And while stranger danger was well-intentioned, we now know that most child sexual abuse is perpetrated by someone the child knows and trusts, not a stranger. We know that 90% of children are sexually abused by someone they know. You can break that down even more into 60% are abused by people the family knows and trusts, and 30% are abused by family members. That leaves only 10% of children being sexually abused by a stranger. The one I like to talk about the most on screen, though, is children being abused by other children. This used to account for a staggering 40% of cases, but there was a study led by Dr. David Finkelhor. He's the director of the Crimes Against Children Research Center at the University of New Hampshire. And they did a national study, and they looked at a sample of over 10,000 victims.
Wow.
Victims and survivors of child sexual abuse. And they found that 70% of children who were sexually abused were abused by other children or youth, not adults. And I think this challenges many of our assumptions and highlights the importance of understanding developmentally appropriate sexual behaviors among youth. Because when we know what's normal, when we know what's healthy as adults, we're better equipped to identify behaviors that are concerning or potentially abusive, and then we can intervene early. And we're going to cover, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about.
Never seen that. Oh my goodness. Really?
Okay. Abusers aren't always, the people that sometimes we have these visions of who these people are in our minds. I mean, we just do, right? They're not always those creepy strangers that we think they are, though. In many cases, they're people who look and act just like everybody else. They might even be highly regarded people in the community, then making it easier to trust them. Appearing to be friendly, likable, trustworthy, someone admired. Abusers will often build relationships with potential victims and their families before the abuse occurs through a process called grooming. I know many people have heard the term grooming, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about it and what that looks like, because it's a deliberate strategy used to gain access, build trust, and reduce the risk of getting caught. And I believe in my heart that it is one of the most important patterns for adults to be able to recognize. And I'll tell you why in 1 second. We're going to start with defining what grooming is. So grooming is a deliberate and manipulative process used by an individual seeking to harm. And this process includes building trust with a potential victim, gradually beginning to blur boundaries through emotional manipulation and secrecy, and then creating conditions that make the abuse more likely to occur, but less likely to be detected. This process is designed to reduce the risk of getting caught and in turn increase the abuser's control. I want to share some recent research here that I think is really important. So the prevalence of sexual grooming behaviors among survivors of childhood sexual abuse reported that 99% of survivors had experienced at least one sexual grooming behavior. And I think this really underscores the importance of recognizing grooming as a central component of child sexual abuse and a key area for prevention. What we know about grooming is grooming can happen online and it can happen in person. And we know it often happens by someone the child knows and trusts. Grooming can take place over short or prolonged periods of time, thinking days, weeks, months, or in some cases, even years. The thing about grooming too is it's not just about gaining access to a child. It's often about gaining trust from the adults around them. In some cases, parents or caregivers are also being groomed. This can look like a generosity that often feels a little bit too good to be true. This sometimes will look like free babysitting, an excessive willingness to help out. It can also be financial assistance to the family or even gifts. Fortunately, the good news is that we as adults can learn to recognize grooming by tuning into what we call red flag behaviors. So we're going to walk through some of those red flag behaviors that you're seeing on the screen. These are often subtle, and they can truly be easily mistaken for kindness or care. So a person who seeks to have one-on-one time with your child or special outings with a specific child, giving one child lots of attention. It can also look like gift giving, a person who buys gifts for a child for no apparent reason. It's not Christmas, it's not a birthday gift. It also could be allowing one child to break the rules, giving one child specific treatment or special treatment. Of a person who's kind of, again, blurring the boundaries. They might be extra touchy with your child, and that they do that in front of other trusted adults often. And I know if you're like me and you hear some of these things, you're like, wait a second, this sounds like something someone in my life does, right? Like I look at this and I'm like, holy crap, my mom, she brings gifts for no apparent reason all the time for my girls. And what I like to tell people, I think it's a valid concern, right? How do we tell the difference then? What I would say is that the key is to look for patterns. If someone is consistently seeking more one-on-one access to a specific child, continuing to push boundaries, and you're seeing these red flag behaviors in a pattern, and your gut is telling you something feels off, I think it's important that we trust that instinct. And then limiting the child's interaction with that person, ensure it's always supervised. You know, I think about it in terms of my mom, because she's just the poor person I point out in this section so much. But yes, she comes with gifts all the time for my girls and bags of crap, from the dollar store. And I could think that she's grooming my children, I guess, but a couple things here. She doesn't bring it for one child, right? When she comes, it's she gets them all the exact same thing, and I have 4 of them, so I mean it's a lot of stuff that ends up in the garbage. But if it was something more concerning to me would be if she was giving it to one of my children, giving one child specific toys or nicer toys or better toys, and then, oh, maybe Lisa, you can come stay night with me. Then I might be like thinking a little bit more in depth and saying, well, something's off here. But so I think it's really good just to put ourselves, level ourselves, and just think about, okay, this doesn't seem like grooming because all of the children are getting it, or now I'm a little concerned because this seems to be like a pattern. Another important signal that we really have to pay attention to is changes in the child's behavior around that individual. That could look like withdrawal, anxiety, clinginess, sudden discomfort can be signs that something's not right. And as we wrap up this section on grooming, we're talking about red flag behaviors. I want to emphasize it's important to exercise caution when you see adults giving unusual amounts of attention to a child, or even if it's touching them unnecessarily, even if it seems like it's in playful ways. And while we know that not every kind neighbor or doting family friend is an abuser, we need to be alert to the possibility. And I just want to remind you of the statistic of 90% of children are sexually abused by someone they know. We must be alert to the possibility. I have the honor of working with survivors all across the state of North Dakota. I've gotten to know just some amazing people, and many have shared with me that they were able to recognize the grooming process, but it was well after the abuse occurred, not while they were in it. And this is called hindsight bias, and it's a painful but common experience. Our goal is to help adults recognize these patterns before harm occurs and to empower them to act proactively without shame or fear. And now, as we continue to move on through our session, we're going to talk about children's sexual development. Understanding healthy childhood sexual development plays a key role in child sexual abuse prevention because there's a link between how we as adults respond to children's sexual development and a child's vulnerability to abuse. So when we as adults are providing children with non-shaming, honest messages, they build protective factors. They start to learn about body awareness, autonomy, healthy boundaries, and all of those things may help reduce their risk of abuse. Yet, many adults, including professionals, aren't taught what to expect as children develop sexually. And the professionals I'm speaking of, just have to stop there. I went to school for early childhood education. And while I learned a lot about motor skills, cognitive development, I do not remember taking one class specific to learning about children's sexual development. And I was going to be working with the youngest of children. We need to acknowledge that sexuality is a normal part of life, even for babies and young children. Like other aspects of development, whether it's gross motor development, physical or brain development, cognitive development, sexual behavior tends to follow a typical trajectory shaped by age, curiosity, and environment. In the many hats that you have worn, for those who are on this call today, just think to yourself, have I ever witnessed a child's behavior and wondered, is this normal? It could be, in your parent, like when you had children or your children were young, did you ever see something and you're like, gosh, I don't know if this is normal. Is this okay? I just want to say I do this work and I work in this field. I've worked in this field for over 3 years, and there are still things where I'm like, oh gosh, is that normal? So this is an area where I think we can always learn more. The best part about this is that when we as adults understand what's developmentally expected, we are better equipped to respond calmly, teach clearly, and intervene when something's off, and in turn, potentially prevent child sexual abuse. When we look at what healthy sexual exploration looks like in children, this is when children engage in sexual behavior that's developmentally typical. And it often has these characteristics. It's consensual and voluntary. Both children agree to the interaction, and it usually occurs between children who play together often. The children are close in age and physical development. The behavior is exploratory in nature. It's not overtly sexual. It's driven by curiosity and learning. It's not forceful. It's not hurtful or aggressive. It's important to acknowledge that these behaviors are typically easy to redirect. Kids can shift gears with little to no additional guidance. These behaviors are lighthearted, spontaneous, mutual, they're age appropriate. They're part of how children learn about bodies, boundaries, and relationships. But the thing is that we need to keep in mind here is that just because the behavior is typical, it does not mean we should ignore it. Often, when we see children displaying sexual behaviors, it's a signal that they need to learn something, and that's our cue to teach, not punish. We want to use a non-shaming tone. We don't want to be punitive. We want to just provide them with clear information and then redirect them to a new activity. The goal is guidance, not blame or that punitive action. And I'm going to give you an example because I think that was a lot of words. And I love examples. So let's just imagine, for whatever reason, you're in a preschool classroom and you hear two 4-year-old girls, they're giggling in like the dramatic play area, like there's a toy house, and you peek in and you find them sitting on the floor with their underwear off, pointing at and laughing at each other's genitals. That could be shocking, right? Instead of getting upset with them and punishing them, we should say, it's okay to be curious about other people's bodies, but private parts should be kept private, even with our friends. And then you redirect. Let's go play with the blocks now. I think it can be easy to react really quickly and harshly in some of these situations, especially when they like catch us off guard like that. But acknowledging that for a 3, 4, 5-year-olds, being curious about other children's bodies is healthy. It's very normal. So then we need to know, okay, I need to educate this child that it's okay to be curious about our bodies and other people's bodies, but our private parts should be kept private, even with our friends, and then redirecting them on to another activity, providing that honest, clear information, non-shaming, and moving on. Some examples of healthy behaviors are a child touching or holding their own genitals, interest in body parts and how they work, curiosity about other children's body parts. As I learned about healthy sexual development in children, I couldn't help but want to learn more about the behaviors that were concerning and why children would engage in them, or what was prompting children to engage in them. So I've had the amazing opportunity to learn from 2 professionals in the field of working with children who have problematic sexual behaviors. And both of these professionals have indicated that research and professional consensus agree that there are 4 factors that may drive a child to engage in concerning sexual behaviors. And you can see those 4 boxes on screen: exposure to sexuality, individual child characteristics, family adversity, and exposure to aggression and coercive control. So we'll start with going over exposure to sexuality. This could be that a child was sexually abused. It could also be that they've witnessed others engage in sexual behaviors. It could be that they've had exposure to sexualized media like pornography. It could also be that they live in a home where there's increased family sexuality. Maybe there's a lack of privacy norms in their home, nudity with no consent or explanation, over-sexualized behavior by their caregivers, really blurring boundaries. There was a case that I was a part of when I worked for a county attorney's office, and this case still sits with me because when I was learning about these concerning sexual behaviors, it just like that case came rushing back, and I remembered some details about it. It was a child, an older boy who had sexually abused a younger girl within an apartment complex. And so I worked in victim services, and as the case progressed, we learned that this boy had a father who had an addiction to pornography. And so that this boy had pretty constant exposure to pornography at a young age. And so I feel like every time I think of this one, or I think of the exposure to sexuality, I cannot help but revert back to that. And before I move on to individual child characteristics, I do want to dig a little deeper into the topic of pornography because I think it's important. I've taken several trainings on the impacts of pornography over the last couple of years. And research varies by study, of course, but many children have seen pornography by the time they're 12 years old. And what that tells us then is that pornography is shaping our children's sexual template. And what they're seeing is violent and degrading acts. And that's creating unhealthy ideas about sex, relationships, and gender. The thing we also know about pornography is that it can lead to addictive patterns by triggering those dopamine surges, and then in turn leading to that compulsive use. And I think we need to take more time to acknowledge the impact that pornography is having on our children. Impact on our boys that are being exposed. They have increased rates of depression. They have increased rates of anxiety. There are increased rates of participating in risky sexual behaviors. The one that scares me the most is that boys who have this exposure to pornography have a lower capacity for empathy. And in one study I read, boys who are exposed to pornography are sexualizing girls as young as 4 to 7 years old at an alarming rate. We also have to acknowledge that there's an impact on our girls, of course, that have this exposure. And that looks like an increase in anxiety, an increase in depression, increase in self-harm, and an increase in self-hatred. I remember the first time I tried to talk to my daughter, she was 9, about pornography. And I just remember not having the answers and not exactly knowing how to have that conversation because it's uncomfortable and it's difficult. And so I was not prepared and I went into it. And within a minute, her head was down like this on the bed. I don't know if you can see me, but she was like, no, this is weird, Mom. And we didn't get very far in the conversation, but I tried. And, I can laugh about it now because yeah, the conversation didn't go how I had hoped. But I did talk about it and I did let her know that if you ever see something like this, these unsafe pictures or these unsafe videos, this is what this is. And you can always come talk to Mom about it. And so meanwhile, it didn't go quite how I had hoped because she shut down. I know that if my daughter is exposed on the school bus or if she's exposed before a sporting event because she doesn't have a device, she's going to know what that is. And she's going to know because her mom told her, and she's going to know that she can talk to her mom about it. And that brings me a lot of comfort. So individual child characteristics. Children with sexual behavior challenges often exhibit other challenging behaviors and social difficulties. This looks like a lack of impulse control. Children who have difficulty following the rules, difficulty making friends or initiating play with others, and limited self-regulation skills. Family adversity. These are factors that adversely impact a caregiver's ability to provide safety, supervision, guidance, behavior management. And this could be due to poverty, it could be due to minimal family support, limited educational opportunities, or trauma. And then lastly, exposure to aggression or coercive control. This would be a child who's living in a home where there is harsh physical discipline, or maybe they're witnessing domestic or interpersonal violence. It could also be a child that's living in a part of town where they are seeing more or have more exposure to community violence. What the professionals tell us is that the driving factors could be from any one or mix of these categories. And research suggests that children exposed to one of these have a higher risk of displaying concerning sexual behaviors. If you want to guess, you can put your guess in the chat box. I'm not really good at getting polls set up, but I will someday. But the answer is children with an exposure to aggression or coercive control. Those children have a higher risk of displaying concerning sexual behaviors. And so what are those concerning sexual behaviors? They're listed on screen. Those are those aggressive or coercive behaviors. They're children who have age-inappropriate knowledge, frequent or compulsive behavior, sexual behavior involving animals, harmful behavior, sexual behavior with significant age differences. What I tell adults is that we must be vigilant in monitoring the children with behaviors on screen when they're around other children. And regardless of the motivation, we must recognize the risk of harm to other children. What we know about these situations and when we're seeing these behaviors is that they require a coordinated intervention. Children who engage in concerning sexual behaviors need specialized help and support to stop the behavior. And the children who are victimized by those behaviors or have been affected by those behaviors need help to recover from that as well. Additionally, counseling for the caregivers and families of the child or youth is an important component to successfully stop the behavior. I have been advised to tell those who witness these behaviors, like you're seeing on screen, to file a report with child protection. Anytime someone has a concern about a child's sexual behavior and it falls under the concerning behaviors we've covered today, intake will screen from there. Additionally, and we're already getting low on time here, we don't have time to talk about the behaviors that fall in between, because it's never going to be just, oh, these are the healthy ones and these are the unhealthy ones, right? It's not just black or white. We have behaviors that kind of fall in between, more cautionary behavior. They're a little bit further away from the norm in terms of persistence, frequency, maybe inequality of power, age, or ability. So we don't get to talk about those today, but I would just like to let you know that I do sessions devoted to sexual development, and where I get to spend more time talking from birth to 18, and we really get to dig into the behaviors, and we get to talk about what's healthy, how to respond, and we just don't have the time for that today, so I apologize. We're going to talk about the signs and impacts of child sexual abuse now. As we talked about earlier, child sexual abuse doesn't always include physical contact. In fact, physical signs of sexual abuse are less common. But those signs would be bruising, cuts, swelling, especially around like the mouth or genital areas or anal areas. Other signs could be pain or difficulty walking or sitting, frequent UTIs or yeast infections. Indirect physical signs could include chronic headaches or tummy aches without a clear medical explanation. And those symptoms are often linked to the child's internal distress and anxiety that surrounding what's occurring, even if they're unable to or unwilling to disclose it directly. What you're seeing on screen are more common, those emotional and behavioral signs. And those are regression of those once grown out of behaviors. So children who sucked their thumb, they stopped, now they're sucking their thumb again, or they stopped wetting their bed, they're wetting their bed again. They might have a unusual fear of certain places or people. They also can have overly compliant behavior or too perfect behavior. That one always stood out to me, and I was like, well, I don't understand this. And I was a part of a training called Darkness to Light, and they had a gold medalist talking about it. And she said that, you know, after my abuse had started, I became the perfect student. I became the perfect kid. I excelled at sports. I was the number one at everything I was doing. And she said it's because it was the only place in my life where I felt like I had any control. Children might also have night terrors, other sleep disturbances, nightmares, a shift in their disposition, resulting in anger or aggressiveness towards family, friends, pets, changing in eating habits, attempts to run away, thinking of themselves or their bodies as bad or dirty. Emotional and behavioral signs are more likely, but they could also be symptoms of other trauma in a child's life, such as physical abuse, neglect, parents' divorce, separation. It's also important to keep in mind that some children exhibit no signs whatsoever. So let's talk about those long-term impacts. The thing I just always want to take a minute to acknowledge is that many child sexual abuse survivors experience psychosocial losses resulting from their traumas. And that can look like a loss of innocence, loss of faith in God, or loss of hope in a higher power, loss of their self-esteem, loss of personal power, loss of their sense of self, and their loss of their ability to feel joy in life. Substance abuse are common problems for those who have experienced child sexual abuse. Mental health problems are a common long-term consequence of child sexual abuse. Obesity and eating disorders, they're more common in women with a history of child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse is also associated with physical health problems in adulthood, and that's because it's a consequence of the substance abuse and mental health issues and the other consequences that survivors of child sexual abuse face. 34% of youth ages 3 to 17 who had been sexually abused had experienced suicidal ideation or behavior. 34%. Sexual abuse was also the strongest predictor of human trafficking. The odds of human trafficking were 2.52 times higher for girls who had experienced sexual abuse, and there was an 8.21 times greater risk for boys who had histories of sexual abuse. People who are sexually abused, these survivors and these victims, have said it affects their entire life. One survivor told me it's like a dark cloud that has followed me, and research backs them up. But it's important to acknowledge that child sexual abuse does not necessarily sentence a victim to an impaired life. People who often get the right treatment, they find the right support, they're able to find healing. They do go on to live their best lives. This is, of course, where I get the most excited because prevention is so important. So I love to talk about the things that we can do as adults to protect children. So we'll talk through these pretty quickly. I know we're getting shorter on time here, and I want to honor our time together. So I'll go through this, but yes. So how can we protect children as adults? Well, number one, we can minimize opportunity. Child sexual abuse most often occurs in one-on-one situations. More than 80% of cases happen when a child is alone with an abuser. But what this tells us is that we actually have power. If we eliminate or reduce one-on-one situations, we're actually going to reduce the risk of sexual abuse. So whenever I talk to people about this, we really need to have good thought process on how can we make interactions with children observable and interruptible. And it doesn't matter if it's in talking to a counselor, swimming lessons, having a play date, any interactions that children are having with others, we need to make sure that they are easy to interrupt and observe. We need to talk about it. To prevent child sexual abuse, we have to break through the stigma and the shame and talk about it. Encouraging open and honest discussions about abuse can help normalize the topic and reduce the associated shame. We need to know the facts, of course, because if we don't understand child sexual abuse, we cannot end it. Understanding the facts can help us protect the children in our lives better. We talked about grooming and red flag behaviors. We talked about how common grooming is. It's helpful for us to look for those patterns of certain behaviors and intervene early, even if what you think you're seeing is trivial. We need to monitor technology. I have a whole session dedicated to safeguarding children online. We need to stay curious, spending time with youth online, be affirming about responsible digital use, sharing in online activities that they enjoy. Pay attention to who children are spending their time with. Talk to children after they spend time with others. This could be after being on the bus, after a friend's house, after a sporting event. Did you play any new games? Was anyone else there? Not just, did you have a good time? Be proactive. If children seem uncomfortable or resistant to being with or near a particular person, ask why. Don't force children to be with that individual. Or if a situation occurs in your life where a person who interacts with your child regularly makes you uncomfortable, trust your intuition. We need to build networks of trusted adults around our children. These are people that we can talk to about everything we've talked to today. They never ask children to keep secrets. They honor body safety rules and respect body safety rules, and they'll always believe them. What I want to say here before we go on to the next section is people who sexually abuse children are likely to run in a different direction if they see that the parent is involved and the child is educated. In the words of one abuser, he said, if I drive up to a bank and I see cop cars outside, I'm going to move on. I'll drive down the street and rob a different bank. When we talk about this, I really like to be clear from the very start. Keeping children safe from sexual abuse is the responsibility of adults. However, these simple yet empowering skills can make all the difference to a child's life. The burden of prevention and protection must sit squarely on the shoulders of adults who are legally and morally responsible for the health and safety of children. But there are many adult survivors who have said that if I would have only known from the first inappropriate touch that it was wrong, how different my life might have been. There have been interviews with convicted sex offenders, And they've said things like, if I had any idea they were talking about it, like the parents were talking to their children about it, the children were educated, I would have thought twice. And there are a lot of people who believe that teaching children the rules of the body and body safety, it takes away their innocence, but I believe with my whole heart that it helps protect it. These are things that I do with my children. Again, just because of time, I'm going to kind of go quick here. I apologize. So one thing we can do is build body autonomy, teaching our children that I am in charge of my body. We're not forced to hug or kiss others, even if it's a close friend of the family. Letting children choose how they want to be touched and respecting their choice. And this also goes to teaching and practicing consent. Autonomy teaches children that they have control, and consent teaches children how to use that control in relationships. It's something children can learn early, and it's one of the most powerful tools we have to promote safety and respect. I would argue that we can teach this even before preschool, especially if we acknowledge the nonverbal cues as valid forms of communication. Secrets. People who sexually abuse children depend on children to keep their secrets. Abusers say things like, "This is our secret and you can't tell anyone." They may threaten to harm the child in a number of ways to keep silent. And children who have not been educated about secrets often don't dare tell anyone. I would encourage people not to use good or happy secrets because abusers have been used to use those terms. Surprises are different because a surprise is something that eventually will be shared with everybody. Birthday party, a surprise gift. I started to consider ways that I can also add another layer in with my children. So we now also have private information, not secrets, but private information, reminding my girls that not everything needs to be shared. Some things are called private information, and that's kind, it's respectful to keep that information private, not a secret. So an example could be a friend who had an accident on the school bus, or someone feeling scared after a movie, or one of their friends needs a stuffy to fall asleep at nighttime. That's private information, and it's kind for us not to share that. They're not secrets or surprises. Teach anatomically correct names for private parts, please. I know we talked about this, but in that one study, 91 convicted sex offenders reported they were less likely to target those children. And then again, one other thing I would just like to hit on before I have to move on here is avoid good and bad touch. I still hear people using that terminology. This can cause confusion in young children because something can still be sexual abuse even though the touch doesn't feel bad. Our bodies are wired to feel good to touch. So using language like good and bad touch can be really, really confusing. With my daughters, I use safe and unsafe touch. And that's how we differentiate. Safe touch is touch that makes us feel comfortable, warm, loved. Unsafe touch makes us feel uncomfortable. And then of course, no one ever touches us in our private areas as well. So I want to go over this section really quickly as we wrap up. It's just some resources and system supports. We have resource guides and caregiver guides available for adults all across North Dakota, Minnesota. I honestly don't care where you are. We'll get them to you. But this is the one on the left is our resource guide. It's aimed at youth serving organizations, child care facilities, Head Start programs, schools. It has a lot of wonderful resources in it, and it has best practices for policies also, and it's updated annually. The one on the right is the guide for caregivers. It is meant for parents. It's meant for foster care parents. It's meant for grandparents. It's all these conversations that we should be having with our children, the understanding that we should have as adults. So if you want either of those guides, you just have to reach out to me and I can get those to you. We have a lot of handouts on our website. It's pcan.org, and you can go and print any of those that you would like to have for your children. Here's some more, like keeping kids safe from sexual abuse on the school bus, to mentoring programs, to overnight programs. We also have available education and awareness sessions. So if you want to learn more about any of the topics on screen, please reach out at any time. And then the last thing is, although the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force has dissolved, the mission continues and it thrives through partnership. And that makes me so happy. Prevention is most possible when we work together. It's through collaboration across agencies, communities, and individuals that we can truly create safer environments for children and sustain momentum for change. When the task force dissolved, they were able to hire a child sexual abuse prevention coordinator. Her name is Kara Hickel, and Kara and I have had the opportunity to collaborate and work together often. She has a background in social work and a master's in public health. And I really wanted to include this here because we all work together and we're all doing everything we can right now to continue the momentum and continue the education and to continue the work to keep children safe from sexual abuse. If you are interested in being a part of this advisory committee, I apologize. I know we're at 1 o'clock. I have one more slide. This is
You ever hear?
This is the Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Network. Anyone can be a part of this if you choose to. We're going to be really looking at working with people all across the state of North Dakota, looking at gaps and barriers in communities and how we can come together as a state to ensure that we can get education to every corner of North Dakota and network and just work together and collaborate. And then lastly, here we go. That was a quick session, holy buckets. This information is never intended to cause alarm or panic. It's just here to equip you with the tools that you need to protect and empower the children in your life. If you need Growing Futures credit, I would just recommend taking the QR code will take you to a survey. If you want a certificate for the survey for attending today, also go there and just fill that out quickly. I think it's like 5 questions. I know I rushed through that. I really apologize. The late start had me off a few minutes, but I hope you were able to leave with some new tools and tricks up your sleeve. And just thank you so much for being here today.
Lindsay, there were just a couple of questions, but I don't know if you want me to share those or get back to them.
Yeah, what are the questions if people
one of them was, has social media increased the levels of CSA over the past 10 years especially?
That's a good question. I personally don't have the data on how that the social media has impacted child sexual abuse. I mean, just from what I know about sexualized media and the impacts that's having, I don't know. I don't want to answer because I'm not quite sure. But I would say that there's probably been correlation.
Yeah, I'd imagine there's future studies probably in the works on that. The other one was just whether you could link or provide the links to some of those studies that you cited in regards, I'm guessing this was in regards to some of the male